Welcome back to Outward Home Learning. The subject's computer science, and today we're looking at client server and peer-to-peer networks. So to find out a bit more about this, we're going to go straight over to Mr. Holton, who's going to explain what these are, and then you're going to have some activities to complete. So over to Mr. Holton.
We often find with networks that we're comparing two different things which are kind of similar. So you might, for example, have a LAN versus WAN, so a local area network versus a wide area network. You might have a mesh topology for a network compared to a star topology. And here's another one. You've got the idea that you've got client server networks and peer-to-peer networks. So let's just cover those two and show the differences really between the two. So let's cover first off how you can identify the two. All right, so here on the left-hand side, I'm going to do a client server network, and it is so easy to identify a client server network because you will have this server. That is how you know you are dealing with a client server network. It has a server in it. If it has a server in it, it's a client server network. I'm going to say that sort of every time, multiple times, and in many different ways I can, because it should be so easy to identify these things. Look here, that is how you know you have a client server network, because it has a server. You're more likely to have this maybe at your school, and really the idea is that you can log into this computer here. You may save a file onto that computer, but what's actually happening is that the file's not being stored in the computer there. It's actually being, and this is, you don't know this is happening in the background, it's being sent to a server and it will store it there. And that means that if you log into a different computer one day, maybe in a different room, then you will still have access to all your files. So you can then retrieve that file if you wanted to, open it and then edit it and save it, and then it'll be sent back to the server. That is a client server network. Your peer-to-peer network is much more likely going to be what you have at home, not guaranteed. You're going to have this idea that you might have you'll still have a central switch. You might have a PC connected to that in some sort of way. You might have another PC in your house, and it's possible you can have two. Maybe that's a laptop or something like that. And then you'll have maybe a phone which is connected wirelessly or something like that. But you know what you don't have? You don't have a server. All right, I just want to make that sort of clear. You could have a phone over here. You could have a phone, but it's still client server on the left hand side because of this server here. But on the right hand side, look, no server. There is no server, so it is peer to peer. All right, and let's just cover briefly what a server does and what a server is. Okay, so a server, and this isn't the best description, but it provides a service. I know it's sort of like using the word in a slightly different way. That service, it's one of these things where maybe better served by an example. It could be, for example, a file server. So a file server will hold, like I showed you before, all the files that you own and then distribute them to the client that you will happen to be using at any given time. So at any time a computer accesses the server and uses it, that computer becomes a client. Or it could be an application server. An application server will control what programs are installed on a computer and do things like keep programs up to date, and it lets you install things quite nice and easily, but we'll come to that in a moment. Okay, so if all your files are on this central server here, it means that backups can be done easily because one computer essentially needs to be backed up. This is faster because you're not going to different computers, and it's also going to be more reliable because it's less likely you're going to forget to accidentally back up one of them. Applications can be installed centrally and pushed out to all computers on the network. So if you've got the latest web browser to install on all the computers, if you think about at home, you'd have to go from from your PC to your laptop and install it twice. But on a client server network, you can just push a button on the server and it will cause every client connected to it to be upgraded to the latest version. And kind of because you got all your files and your applications in one place, it means that security can be controlled centrally as well. So I can force every computer to have the latest version of antivirus installed, for example. And that way I've got a bit more of a confidence that my computers can protect themselves against any sort of attack from malware. But there are some, significant disadvantages for client server networks. First off is the cost that are involved in them. So, for example, I have to spend money to buy this server, and the server has to be usually a pretty powerful PC. if it's going to serve any sort of significant size network. So there's a cost to set up for that, but there's also the cost that if you're dealing with, again, a school network or an office network, that somebody's probably going to be paid to maintain this server, so to stop it from collapsing and to stop your whole network to then fall down shortly afterwards. So there's definitely a cost issue here because you have to pay that person a salary. You've also got the idea that should the worst happen and the server goes down, you've got a central point of failure. So if the server collapses, your whole network might collapse. Now, it depends kind of what server goes down. So you might have, for example, your file server go down. That means that nobody can access the files. That would be awful. But maybe if a print server went down, that wouldn't be too much of an issue, just sort of means that nobody would be able to print their files. But certainly a server going down may break the network. Okay, so when we're comparing and contrasting this to a peer-to-peer, really it's just the opposites that we have to think about here. So for example, backups can't be done centrally, so they take longer to do, and you are much more likely to sort of like miss a file because you have to worry about backing up several different devices on that network. And like I said, we really are dealing with opposites here. So your programs and files on each computer might be different. That can be an issue. So if you've got an essential program, I don't know, something like Microsoft Word installed on one computer, you won't necessarily have it installed on another. So you might not be able to work on that computer. Security can vary kind of massively depending on device and how often that is updated. And that, can be a big issue because often attacks really are just looking for the weakest device on the network and they'll exploit that. However, they are cheaper. That is, we talked about this. They are, you don't have to employ somebody to look after any server, and you don't have to actually buy the server itself. And likewise, you don't have to worry about a server crashing. Okay, if an individual computer breaks, that computer can't be used, but you don't have to worry about that central point of failure, which could bring down the entire network. And there are your differences between client server and peer-to-peer.
So now you've heard a little bit about what peer-to-peer and client server networks are. You've now got a task to complete. There's a number of true or false statements on your first activity. This might take you a bit less than 10 minutes, but there's a 10-minute timer there in case you need it. You can always skip on. So 10 minutes starting now. Off you go. So hopefully you had time to complete that. We're now going to Mr. Barnes to review the answers.
Right then, let's have a look at this activity about client-server and peer-to-peer networks. So what we've got here is a series of statements, and effectively what we need to do is read them and decide whether that statement is true or false about client-server or peer-to-peer networks. So let's get started. So with a client-server network, the files are stored on the hard drive of each workstation. Well, the answer to that is false. Okay, when you have a client-server network, you will have a file server that stores all of the files in one central location, and that makes it much easier to backup because you back up one place rather than each individual workstation. We've then got larger client-server networks use more than one server for different purposes. Well, that's true. I just mentioned file server as one type of server which will store files, but you might have things like a print server which manages all the printing on that network, or an email server. So you've got more than one server available. So the client part of the network is the workstations that are connected to the network. Well, that is true. So on a client server network, you have clients, which are your PCs or your devices, and they use the services of the server. They are the client, and the server offers the services. Would you like to print? Would you like to have access to this network? Would you like to store files? It's offering those services, and the client, which is the device, uses those services. So then we've got servers in a client server network send requests to the client. Well, they don't send requests. The clients send the request to the server. Please, can I store files in this location? And the server will accept it or decline it. The server will then send a response. So that is false. We've then got clients in a client-server network are used to manage the server. Well, that's also false. The server controls the network. It is the manager. It's the thing offering those services. So we've got client-server networks allow files to be stored in a central location. We've already mentioned that they're not stored on each device, therefore that must be true. Client-server networks do not require specially trained staff to manage them. Well, that's false. Client-server networks are often far more complex to put together, and therefore you need people with the appropriate training and qualifications to manage them. We've then got peer-to-peer networks also use a server. So we've gone from client-server, now we're on peer-to-peer. So peer-to-peer networks is false. They do not use a server. Okay, it is a number of devices that connect to each other, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So each PC or device acts as a server and a client in a peer-to-peer network. Well, that's true. So for example, if you've got some devices on a network, and let's say device A has a printer, well, device B can ask to use that printer. In that situation, device B would act as the client and device A would act as the server because it's offering a service of using the printer. However, let's imagine device B has access to the internet and device A now wants to use it. Well, suddenly device A becomes a client and device B becomes the server because it's offering that service, so they can be both. Peer-to-peer network devices have control over their own device. That is true. So if you're on a peer-to-peer network, you are responsible for your own file storage. You are responsible for making sure software is up to date, like antivirus software. You have control. The server doesn't control that. So there are your answers for the client server and peer-to-peer activity.
So it's now time for the last part of the lesson, which is where you get to complete an exam style question, or there's 2 exam style questions for you to complete. You've got 10 minutes to do that. We're going to review the answers afterwards. Off you go. And finally, we're now going to go over to Mr. Barnes, who's going to review those answers. Make sure you amend your answers as you go. Over to Mr. Barnes.
Right, let's have a look at these questions about client-server and peer-to-peer networks as part of our deliberate practice. So we've got here question 1 then. In his home, Mr. Singh has a peer-to-peer network. Explain what is meant by a peer-to-peer network. 2 marks. So we need to say, just roughly, what a peer-to-peer network is and then what that means they can do on that network. So I'm going to say, on a peer-to-peer network, on a peer-to-peer network, devices act as a client and a server. They are all equal. This allows for sharing of files between each other. And remember, peer-to-peer networks, things like BitTorrent are peer-to-peer because you just share with someone else. Okay, question 2 then. National supermarkets use a client-server network to connect their checkout computers to the store's server. Describe 2 benefits to national supermarkets of using a client-server network instead of a peer-to-peer network. So we need 2 benefits. It's 4 marks. We need to identify the benefit and then explain how it can help national supermarkets. Okay, so I'm going to start with the most obvious one. All files are stored on the central server. This means workers can access their files from any device. Okay, so I've made the point of all the files are stored on the central server and then I've explained how it is beneficial to them. Okay, the next one I'm going to go for is very, very simple. Again, is going to be as all files, let's try that again, as all files are stored on the central server, backups can be done centrally. Okay, this means the company does not need to back up each device. Okay, so I've talked about it being backed up centrally and then I've said why that's a good thing. Right, let's go through these answers then. So the first question, explain what a peer-to-peer network is. So I have said on a peer-to-peer network, devices act as a client and a server. They are all equal. So I've got here first mark point, all computers have equal status. Perfect, 1 mark. And then I've explained how that works. So this means that sharing a file, this allows for sharing files between each other. And the second mark point, we've got to share data or files between each other. So there we go, 2 marks. There's not much movement in the mark scheme there for that. Okay, on to question 2 then. If I just move everything up a little bit. So question 2 was 2 benefits of using a client-server network instead of peer-to-peer. So let me move this up. So let's start with the first benefit. So I've said all files are stored on the central server. This means workers can access their files from any device. So we've got here all files can be stored centrally, so on the central server. So workers can access files from any computer. So workers can access the files from any device. So that gets me 2 marks. So you could have also said that, you know, you can update the central file system. Peer-to-peer, it might not, files might be stored on different computers and so on. So you could have looked at it as why peer-to-peer are not as good. And then for the second benefit, I've said as all files are stored on the central server, backups are done centrally. So we've got backups are central, 1 mark. This means the company does not need to back up each device. So we've got individual computers do not need to back up their own data. Perfect, and that gets me 4 marks. Let's very quickly have a look at other possibilities. So we could have said it makes it easier to monitor clients, to make sure everyone's working correctly. You could say you can upgrade your software centrally, so you can just push out upgraded software to everyone. You don't need to go and install it on each computer. And you can have central security, things like firewalls, antiviruses. The protection doesn't need to be installed on every computer. It can just be installed on that one, on the server, and it can manage it. So there are your answers on client server and peer-to-peer networks.
And that's everything you need to know about client server and peer-to-peer networks for your GCSE. See you next time.